Born Louisa May Highway in 1906, she grew up in the industrial northern town of Wigan. She went on to have 6 children, 4 boys, 2 girls. 2 of the boys sadly died in infancy. She lost her remaining children when she received the first custodial sentence, 84 days, for ration book fraud. This type of crime wasn't unusual at this time. We were just out of the Second World War, and supplies were starting to replenish. As people passed away or moved on, it wasn't unusual for people to carry on claiming their rations. On her release, she went on to have an unremarkable life as a domestic cleaner until she met her third husband, Alfred Merrifield. He sounded just as terrible as her. He'd walked out on his wife with 10 children, and both could be found often drunk in the pubs and clubs around Blackpool, a small holiday town in the northwest of England. Both fleeted from job to job, often losing them for being too drunk to work, hungover, or petty theft. It was on the 12th of March 1953, Sarah Ann Ricketts would have the misfortune of hiring the couple as a living housekeeper and handyman. Ricketts was a notoriously difficult woman, often changing her mind just to irritate people. Notorious for it, so much so that she was left abandoned by her own 2 daughters. This is why she came to rely on Louisa. Despite Louisa being very unreliable, she was needed by Mrs. Ricketts. 2 headstrong women living in the same house, it was soon to become a nightmare. Mrs. Ricketts soon became tired and expressed her concern about how her money was being spent. She was worried it was being spent on alcohol in the local pubs by both of the Merrifields, rather than supplies for the cupboards and the upkeep of a bungalow. The relationship soon became so much that Merrifield would spend most of her time in the pub rather than looking after Mrs. Ricketts. She told the regulars in the pub, her friends and extended family, that Mrs. Ricketts had already died and left her the bungalow in her will. Upon hearing this, Mrs. Ricketts changed her will so that her 2 estranged daughters would receive everything. Upon hearing this, Mrs. Merrifield was said to be absolutely fuming, babes, and hatched a plan to coerce her into changing her will. It didn't take long. Mrs. Ricketts agreed and changed the will, so everything was left to Louisa. All she had to do now was sit and wait for Mrs. Ricketts to die, and she would inherit everything. But she was impatient. She wanted everything now, so hatched a plan to get rid of Mrs. Ricketts herself. On the 9th of April, Mrs. Ricketts fell poorly. She was really ill, so Louisa called for the doctor. And Dr. Yule, despite being a very well-respected and well-loved doctor with plenty of experience, it appears he was a little naive. Louisa Merrifield had convinced him that he should sign a document saying that he'd witnessed the will being signed by a happy and willing Mrs. Ricketts. She'd also convinced him that Mrs. Ricketts was ill, gravely ill. He left believing that she was really, really poorly. Only 5 days later, Louisa called for Dr. Yule again, but he was unable to attend and sent a Dr. Wood in his place. Dr. Wood arrived and diagnosed her with a mild case of bronchitis, believing that's all it was, and she was going to be fine. He was also asked to sign a document about witnessing the will that Dr. Yule had signed a few days before, but after talking to Mrs. Ricketts, he refused to do it, believing she was being coerced, again leaving Louisa Merrifield absolutely fuming, babes. Another one of Mrs. Ricketts' habits was to sit in the window and watch people go by. She would sit there and eat jam straight from the jar with a large glass of heavy stout. Merrifield saw this as her opportunity, so she went to the chemist and bought Rodine, a very popular rat poison sold by most pharmacies at the time. On the way back from the pharmacy, she bumped into her friend, Jessie Brewer. They went back to Jessie's house for a cup of tea and a chat. Brewer passed on her condolences, believing that Mrs. Ricketts had already passed because Louisa had been telling people in the pub that she died. But Merrifield replied saying she wasn't dead, that she was very much alive, but that was soon to be changing, and said clear as day that she was going home to lay out that old woman. Mrs. Ricketts died later that night, but the Merrifields didn't call the police, the coroner, the doctor, or her daughters. In fact, they said they knew she was dead, nobody could help her, so they didn't want to bother people so late at night. So instead of calling the police, she waited till the next morning and called the Salvation Army instead, and asked them to stand outside the house and sing Abide By Me on repeat, and only let her and her husband back into the house. Whilst they were singing Abide By Me, the Merrifields went to see the funeral director George Jackson and asked him to cremate her very quickly and not to notify her estranged daughters, as she didn't want them to know the death or have anything to do with the funeral. As part of the service, the funeral director announced her death in the local paper. Jessie Brewer read this and called the police immediately to let them know what Merrifield had told her a few days before. The police immediately launched an investigation. They searched the Merrifields' Ricketts house but didn't find any poison. Luckily, everyone purchasing poison had to sign the poison register, which was a legal requirement at the time. Upon looking, they saw it in the pharmacy. She had signed it under her own name, complete with her address and details. Next, they requested a post-mortem and asked the coroner to look for signs of rhodine. After he found some, and with the signature on the poison list, both Merrifields were arrested and charged with murder. They were soon taken to Manchester for trial under the high-profile Justice Glyn Jones. The Attorney General, Sir Lionel Herald QC, led for the prosecution, and Mr. Jack Massoud Eric Dayham QC for the defence. It made for a very high-profile case, which led to people not having a very good impression of Miss Merrifield. She would arrive at court every day, smiling for the photographers, waving to the media, and rubbing people up the wrong way with her arrogance. Dr. Yule and Dr. Woods both testified against Mrs. Merrifield at the trial, as did her ex-friend Jessie Brewer. The trial lasted just 11 days before finding both the Merrifields guilty on all charges. Louisa was sentenced to death, but Alfred Merrifield, the jury couldn't reach a verdict on him, so he was acquitted, with the jury describing him as just a tragic simpleton who was led on by Miss Merrifield. She tried to appeal her sentence, but the case was dismissed by the then Home Secretary, David Maxwell Fyfe. So on the 18th of September 1953, Louisa Merrifield was hanged at Manchester's Strangeways Prison by the famous hangsman Albert Pierpoint. She would only be the fourth and the last woman to be hung at Strangeways. Following the execution, though, the lovable simpleton Alfred Merrifield soon became very astute and continued to live life at Mrs. Ricketts' bungalow. He later died in 1962, aged 80.